The morning sun cast long shadows across Copper Creek's dusty Main Street, as Ezra Thornfield worked his bellows with hands that shook more each passing day. At 67, the blacksmith's once powerful frame had bent under decades of hammer work, and the weight of memories he kept buried deeper than any grave. His forge, which had once rung with the music of steel and fire, now wheezed like an old man's lungs struggling for breath. Ezra squinted through wire-rimmed spectacles at the horseshoe taking shape on his anvil. The arthritis in his knuckles made each strike deliberate, careful. Where once he could shape iron with the fury of a thunderstorm, now he coaxed metal like a grandfather teaching a stubborn child. His gray beard caught sparks that fell like dying stars, and his pale blue eyes watered from the smoke that seemed to sting worse each year. The bell above his door chimed with the authority of spurs and badge metal. Sheriff Marcus Dalton filled the doorway like a storm cloud, his bulk casting the small forge into shadow. Behind him stood 3 deputies, their hands resting casual but ready on their gun belts. Dalton's face wore the cruel smile of a man who had never met resistance he couldn't break. "You're behind on your protection fees again, old man." Dalton's voice carried the weight of absolute power in a town that had forgotten what justice looked like. The leather of his gun belt creaked as he stepped inside, his boots heavy on the packed earth floor. Ezra set down his hammer with the care of a man placing flowers on a grave. "I paid what I could, Sheriff. Business isn't what it used to be." His voice held the weariness of a man who had seen too much and said too little. "That's your problem, not mine." Dalton picked up a finished horseshoe from the cooling rack, examining it with the air of a man inspecting inferior goods. "This town runs on order, Thornfield. My order. Protection costs money." The door chimed again, gentler this time. Sarah McKenna entered carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, her widow's black dress dusty from the morning ride. At 26, she carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had buried love but not hope. Her auburn hair caught the forge light, and her green eyes held the determined sadness of someone fighting to keep her late husband's memory alive through simple perseverance. "Good morning, Mr. Thornfield. Are Thomas's tools ready?" Sarah's voice carried the musical lilt of educated Eastern speech, incongruous in this rough frontier settlement. Dalton's attention shifted like a predator scenting new prey. Well, the pretty widow graces us with her presence." His deputies chuckled, the sound ugly in the forge's confined space. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes on Ezra. "I can come back later if you're conducting business." "No business here that concerns decent folk," Ezra said quietly, moving to stand between Sarah and the lawman. "Your husband's tools are ready, Mrs. McKenna. Fine work, every piece." Dalton stepped closer, his bulk intimidating in the small space. "Everything in this town concerns me, widow woman, including what a woman alone might need protection from." The threat hung in the smoky air like the scent of burning leather. Ezra's hands tightened on the anvil's edge, his knuckles white beneath scarred skin. "I think you gentlemen have said your piece. Have we now?" Dalton reached out and swept a dozen horseshoes from the cooling rack. They clattered against the forge's stone floor like iron bones. "Clumsy of me. This old place is dangerous. Accidents happen." Sarah gasped as one shoe struck her skirt, leaving a sooty mark on the black fabric. Ezra took a half step forward, something shifting in his pale eyes like winter ice cracking under pressure. "That's enough, Sheriff." Dalton laughed, the sound harsh as grinding metal. "Or what, old man? You'll shoo me to death?" His deputies joined the laughter, their hands still ready on their weapons. In their eyes, Ezra saw the casual cruelty of men who had never faced consequence for their actions. They saw an elderly blacksmith with shaking hands and failing eyes, a man whose best years had died with the war that had forged him. But none of them noticed how Ezra's stance had subtly changed, how his breathing had steadied despite his apparent frailty. None of them saw the way his scarred fingers found the handle of his work hammer with the unconscious precision of long practice. "The protection fee doubles starting tomorrow, Thornfield, and the widow there might find herself in need of special protection if she keeps wandering around unescorted." Dalton tipped his hat in mock courtesy. "Good day, Mrs. McKenna. Mind you stay safe." As the lawmen filed out, their laughter echoing in the morning air, Sarah moved to help gather the scattered horseshoes. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked. "I'm sorry you were subjected to that because of me," Ezra said softly. Sarah's green eyes met his, and in them he saw a strength that reminded him of women who had endured the war years. "We all choose what we endure, Mr. Thornfield. The question is what we choose to do about it." Outside, Copper Creek continued its daily business, but the forge had grown quiet except for the whisper of cooling metal and the soft sound of an old man's breathing as he watched the dust settle where justice had once stood. 3 days passed before Sheriff Dalton returned, but when he came, he brought company. 6 deputies flanked him this time, their boots drumming a steady rhythm against the boardwalk planks. The afternoon sun caught the metal of their badges and gun barrels, creating a display of authority that made Copper Creek's main street seem smaller, more confined. Ezra stood at his forge, working a piece of iron for Sarah's wagon wheel rim. The metal glowed orangered in the coals, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the autumn chill. His movements remained careful, deliberate, each hammer strike placed with the precision of a man who had learned to compensate for failing strength with accumulated wisdom. Dalton entered without ceremony, his bulk filling the doorway like a landslide. The deputies spread out behind him, their hands resting easy on their weapons. Their eyes held the casual confidence of men who had never faced serious opposition. "Thornfield, time's up on those protection fees." Dalton's voice carried the finality of a judge's gavel. "You owe the town $50, plus penalties for being late." $50 was more money than most families in Copper Creek saw in 2 months. Ezra set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his leather apron, the movement slow and methodical. "I don't have $50, Sheriff. Haven't had that kind of money since the war ended." "Then you're in violation of town ordinances." Dalton stepped closer, his shadow falling across the anvil. "That's a serious offense." The door chimed, and Sarah entered carrying a small basket covered with checkered cloth. She stopped short when she saw the assembled lawmen, her green eyes quick to assess the tension that filled the forge like smoke. "Mrs. McKenna." Dalton's voice turned oily smooth. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing Mr. Thornfield's financial difficulties. Before I go any further, let me pause this tale for just a moment. If you're enjoying this story of justice and courage, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more tales from the Old West. Comment what country you're listening from. I love seeing how these stories of standing up to corruption travel around the world. Now, let's see what happens when Sheriff Dalton pushes too far. Sarah's chin lifted with quiet defiance. "Mr. Thornfield's business is his own, Sheriff. Everything in this town is my business, widow." Dalton gestured to one of his deputies, a thick-set man with dead eyes and tobacco-stained teeth. "Brock here thinks you might be more comfortable with proper male protection. A woman alone attracts the wrong kind of attention." Deputy Brock stepped forward with predatory confidence. His hand reached out to touch Sarah's arm, fingers gripping her elbow with possessive familiarity. "Maybe the widow needs to learn some manners about showing proper respect." "I'd think twice about that path, Sheriff." Ezra's voice cut through the forge's smoky air with unexpected authority. The words were quiet, but they carried an undertone that made the deputies pause. Dalton laughed, the sound harsh as grinding stone. "Listen to him, boys. The old man's found his backbone. Let go of her." Ezra stepped away from the anvil, his movement more fluid than it had been moments before. Something had changed in his bearing, a subtle shift that transformed his apparent frailty into something else entirely. "Or what, Grandpa?" Dalton's meaty fist came around in a vicious backhand that caught Ezra across the cheek. The old blacksmith stumbled backward, blood trickling from his split lip. "You'll what exactly?" The deputies roared with laughter, their voices echoing off the forge's stone walls. Brock tightened his grip on Sarah's arm, his other hand moving to her waist with insulting familiarity. She tried to pull away, but his strength overwhelmed her resistance. "That was a mistake." Ezra's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but every man in the forge heard it clearly. His pale blue eyes had gone cold as winter steel, and when he straightened, the illusion of age-bent weakness fell away like a discarded coat. He reached for his work hammer, the heavy tool that had shaped iron for decades. The handle settled into his scarred palm with the familiarity of an old friend returning home after a long journey. "Look at that, boys." Dalton's voice dripped with mock terror. The blacksmith's got his little hammer. I'm shaking in my boots. But the laughter died as Ezra's grip shifted on the hammer's handle. His stance widened slightly, weight settling on the balls of his feet with the unconscious precision of a fighter who had learned his trade in places where hesitation meant death. His breathing steadied, and the tremor that had plagued his hands disappeared entirely. Deputy Brock released Sarah's arm, his attention now fully focused on the old man who no longer seemed quite so old. The hammer in Ezra's hand looked different now, not a tool, but a weapon that had found its way home to a master who remembered how to use it. The forge's temperature seemed to drop despite the glowing coals. Outside, the sounds of Copper Creek's daily business continued, but inside the smithy, 6 armed men suddenly found themselves wondering if their numbers were enough. Ezra took a single step forward, and something in that movement made Deputy Brock reach for his gun. But the blacksmith's hammer came up faster than should have been possible for a man his age, the flat head catching the deputy's wrist with surgical precision. Bone cracked like dry kindling, and the gun fell unfired to the forge's earthen floor. The scream that followed echoed off stone walls and sent Sarah stumbling backward toward the door. But she didn't run. Instead, she pressed herself against the wall and watched as 67 years fell away from Ezra Thornfield like morning mist before the rising sun. What followed happened too fast for the remaining deputies to process. The hammer moved in Ezra's hands like it was alive, deflecting a knife thrust from one man, while the return stroke caught another across the temple. His footwork was precise, economical, each movement flowing into the next with deadly grace. Sheriff Dalton drew his gun with desperate haste, but Ezra was already inside his reach. The hammer's handle struck the sheriff's wrist, and the Colt discharged harmlessly into the forge's stone ceiling. The sound was deafening in the confined space, filling the air with gun smoke and the smell of black powder. When the smoke cleared, 5 deputies lay groaning on the forge floor. Dalton stood frozen against the back wall, his empty hands raised in surrender, staring at a man he no longer recognized. Ezra stood in the center of the chaos, breathing steady and controlled. The hammer hung loose in his grip, its head dark with more than soot. His pale eyes surveyed the wreckage with professional detachment, cataloging injuries and assessing threats with the automatic precision of long experience. The silence stretched between them like a drawn blade. Outside, Copper Creek continued its business, unaware that inside the forge, the balance of power had shifted as suddenly and completely as a landslide changing the course of a river. The gunshot had drawn a crowd. Faces appeared in windows and doorways along Copper Creek's main street, drawn by the unmistakable sound of violence that every frontier settlement knew too well. The forge's door stood open, and through it came the groans of wounded men and the acrid smell of gun smoke mixed with coal fire. Old Pete Garrison pushed through the gathering crowd, his weathered face creased with concern. At 73, Pete had seen the town grow from a handful of tents to a proper settlement, and he knew trouble when he heard it. But when he reached the forge's doorway and looked inside, his lined face went white as fresh snow. The scene before him was chaos. 5 deputies lay scattered across the forge floor in various states of consciousness. Sheriff Dalton pressed himself against the back wall, his empty hands raised in surrender. And in the center of it all stood Ezra Thornfield, hammer in hand, breathing steady as a man who had just finished routine work. But it was not the carnage that made Pete's blood run cold. It was the way Ezra held that hammer. The grip, the stance, the way his shoulders set square to face multiple opponents. Pete had seen that exact posture 43 years ago in a muddy field outside Antietam, when a Union blacksmith had held off 12 Confederate cavalry with nothing but his war hammer and the kind of cold fury that made grown men weep. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God." Pete's voice came out as barely a whisper, but in the sudden silence following the gunfight, every word carried clear as church bells. "That's Iron Ezra Thornfield." The name hit the crowd like a physical blow. Conversations died mid-sentence. Women covered their mouths with their hands. Men who had been pushing forward to see the excitement suddenly found reasons to step backward. Sarah McKenna, still pressed against the forge wall, looked between Pete's terrified expression and Ezra's calm demeanor with growing understanding. Sheriff Dalton's face drained of what little color remained. "Can't be," he croaked. Iron Ezra died in the war. Everyone knows that. Pete shook his grizzled head, his eyes never leaving Ezra's weathered features. Iron Ezra Thornfield never died, Sheriff. He just disappeared, faded away like smoke after Appomattox. But I served under General McClellan. I seen this man work. The crowd pressed closer despite their fear, drawn by the magnetism of legend made flesh. Pete's voice gained strength as memory overtook caution. 23 Confederate officers. That's what the records show. 23 men killed in single combat with that hammer you're looking at. They called it judgment, and it earned its name in blood from Bull Run to Richmond. Ezra remained motionless in the center of the forge, his pale blue eyes fixed on Dalton's terrified face. The hammer hung loose in his grip, but every man present could feel the potential violence it represented. "You weren't just a blacksmith," Pete continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a man reciting scripture. "Days, he forged weapons for the Union Army. Swords, bayonets, horseshoes for cavalry mounts. But nights, he slipped behind Confederate lines like death itself." The old soldier's eyes grew distant, lost in memories of campfire stories told in hushed whispers. They said he could forge a blade that would hold its edge through 100 battles. Said his hammers never missed their mark. But mostly, they said he was the kind of man you wanted on your side and never, ever wanted hunting you. Dalton swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thick neck. "That's just stories, old man. War tales get bigger in the telling." Ezra spoke for the first time since the violence ended, his voice carrying the flat certainty of absolute truth. 40 years I've kept this hammer cold, Sheriff. 40 years since I last used it for what it was made for." His pale eyes swept the crowd that had gathered outside the forge, meeting gazes that quickly looked away. The people of Copper Creek saw him now not as the aged blacksmith who shoed their horses and mended their tools, but as something altogether more dangerous. "I came here to forget what I was. To make horseshoes instead of widows. To shape metal for building instead of breaking." Ezra's voice remained steady, but Sarah heard something beneath it, a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights and memories that wouldn't stay buried. Pete nodded slowly, understanding passing between the two old soldiers. After Appomattox, some men went home to their families. Others went west to forget. But a few, a very few, just disappeared entirely. Changed their names, buried their past, tried to become someone else. "The war changed us all," Pete said quietly. "Some of us just changed more than others." Deputy Brock, cradling his shattered wrist against his chest, tried to push himself upright. His face was gray with pain and shock. "You're bluffing. Ain't no way some old blacksmith is some kind of legendary killer." Ezra's attention shifted to the wounded deputy with the lethal focus of a hawk spotting prey. The hammer in his hand moved slightly, just a small adjustment of grip, but the movement made Brock freeze entirely. 23 Confederate officers, Ezra repeated, his voice soft as silk and twice as deadly. Each one thought he was facing just a blacksmith. Each one discovered his mistake too late to matter. The crowd outside the forge had grown to include most of Copper Creek's population. Word was spreading through the settlement like wildfire, carried by whispers and wide-eyed stares. The legend of Iron Ezra Thornfield had walked among them for years, shoeing their horses and mending their tools, and none of them had known. Sarah found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Why did you stop? After the war, why did you disappear?" Ezra's pale eyes found hers across the forge's smoky interior. "Because every man I killed had a name, Mrs. McKenna. Every officer who fell to this hammer was someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father. The war ended, but the killing didn't have to continue." He lifted the hammer slightly, examining its worn head in the forge's ruddy light. "I've spent 40 years trying to atone for what this did, making things instead of breaking them, building instead of destroying." Sheriff Dalton's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Look, Thornfield, maybe we can work something out here. No need for anyone else to get hurt." The transformation in Ezra's demeanor was instant and terrifying. The weariness vanished, replaced by something cold and implacable as winter death. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You're right, Sheriff. No one else needs to get hurt. You and your men are going to leave now. You're going to ride out of Copper Creek and never come back. And if I hear of you troubling decent folks anywhere else, I'll come looking for you. But we're the law, Dalton protested weakly. Ezra's pale eyes seemed to glow in the forge's reflected firelight. The law serves justice, Sheriff. What you've been doing here isn't law. It's just cruelty with a badge. The deputies who could still walk began helping their wounded companions toward the door. The crowd parted before them like they carried plague, and indeed, they did carry something nearly as contagious, the knowledge that their reign of terror in Copper Creek had ended. Pete Garrison touched his hat brim in a gesture of respect that belonged to another time, another war. It's an honor, sir, even after all these years. Ezra nodded once, a soldier's acknowledgement between men who had seen the elephant and lived to speak of it. The honor was mine, Sergeant. Thank you for your service. As the defeated lawmen stumbled into the afternoon sunlight, Sheriff Dalton paused at the threshold. This isn't over, Thornfield. Yes, Sheriff, Ezra replied, his voice carrying the finality of a coffin lid closing. It is. Sheriff Dalton's retreat lasted exactly 3 minutes. The sound of his boots pounding down the boardwalk was followed by the sharp blast of a whistle, the kind used to summon every deputy and hired gun within hearing distance. The crowd that had gathered outside the forge began to scatter like leaves before a storm, mothers pulling children into shops, and men finding urgent business elsewhere. But not everyone fled. Old Pete Garrison planted his feet beside the forge door, his arthritic hands steady as he checked the load in his ancient Navy Colt. Sarah McKenna pressed herself against the stone wall, but made no move to leave. A handful of other townspeople, men who had endured Dalton's corruption for too long, took positions around the forge yard with whatever weapons they could find. Ezra watched through the open doorway as armed men emerged from buildings throughout Copper Creek. Dalton had called in every badge-wearing bully and hired gun on his payroll. The sheriff's voice carried across the settlement, high and desperate with the authority of a man whose bluff had been called. Iron Ezra Thornfield is a wanted man, boys. Federal warrant for war crimes. Man who brings him and gets $1,000 bounty. The lie was clever, appealing to greed rather than loyalty. Within minutes, a dozen armed men had gathered in the street facing the forge. They carried rifles, shotguns, and enough iron to outfit a small cavalry unit. Their faces held the hungry look of men who saw easy money standing between them and early retirement. Ezra began to methodically remove his leather apron, the movements deliberate and ritualistic. Beneath the protective leather, his arms revealed a map of old violence. Scars crisscrossed his forearms like railroad tracks, some from Confederate sabers, others from the countless hours spent working red-hot metal. His shoulders, broad despite his age, bore the unmistakable bearing of a career soldier. The forge itself became his ally. 40 years of working in this space had taught him every stone, every shadow, every angle of advantage. He moved to the bellows and pumped air into the coals until they glowed white-hot. The temperature in the small building rose like the inside of an oven, but Ezra seemed unaffected by heat that would have driven younger men to their knees. "Come on out, Thornfield," Dalton called from the street. "Make this easy on everyone." Instead of answering, Ezra picked up a length of iron rod from his stockpile and thrust it into the forge fire. The metal began to glow within seconds, transforming from black to red to orange. He held it like a brand, the superheated tip radiating waves of visible heat. The first deputies to enter the forge did so with the overconfidence of men who had terrorized shopkeepers and farmers. They saw an elderly blacksmith cornered in his workshop, outnumbered 6 to 1. What they failed to notice was how the forge's layout favored a single defender who knew every inch of the terrain. The lead deputy, a thick-necked man named Crawford, stepped through the doorway with his shotgun leveled. "Drop that hammer, old man, and maybe this ends quick." Ezra's response was to swing the red-hot iron rod in a wide arc. Crawford threw himself backward, but the superheated metal passed close enough to his face to singe his eyebrows. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. The deputy's confidence evaporated as he realized he was facing a man who would use any weapon at hand. The second man through the door tried to flank left, but Ezra had positioned himself perfectly. The anvil blocked the deputy's line of fire, while giving Ezra a solid barrier to work from. His hammer came down on the anvil's edge, sending a shower of sparks into the deputy's eyes. Blinded and panicking, the man stumbled backward into his companions. What followed was not a gunfight, but a masterclass in tactical awareness. Ezra used the forge's confined space to prevent his opponents from bringing their superior numbers to bear. They could only come at him one or two at a time, and he met each attack with 40 years of accumulated skill. Crawford recovered from his near-singing and tried to rush the anvil. Ezra's hammer met him halfway, the flat head striking the deputy's wrist with surgical precision. Bone cracked audibly, and the shotgun discharged harmlessly into the stone ceiling. Before Crawford could scream, the return stroke of the hammer caught him across the temple, dropping him unconscious to the earthen floor. A deputy named Morrison tried to get an angle from the forge's window, but Ezra had anticipated this. A handful of white-hot coals, flipped from the fire with practiced ease, scattered across the window opening. Morrison jerked back with a curse, his rifle barrel too hot to hold where the glowing carbon had touched it. The remaining 3 deputies rushed simultaneously, thinking numbers would overwhelm skill. It was their final mistake. Ezra moved through them like winter wind through wheat, his hammer striking with mechanical precision. One man's knee buckled as the weapon caught him across the kneecap. Another doubled over when the hammer's handle drove into his solar plexus. The third managed to draw his pistol before the hammer's head rang off his skull like a bell. Sheriff Dalton appeared in the doorway, his face purple with rage and desperation. His Colt Peacemaker filled his hand with practiced speed, the barrel tracking toward Ezra's chest. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space, muzzle flash lighting the forge like lightning. But the bullet never found flesh. Ezra's hammer came up in an impossible display of reflexes, the flat iron head intercepting the lead slug with a sound like a blacksmith strike. The bullet, flattened by the impact, ricocheted harmlessly into the stone wall. The crowd that had gathered outside the forge gasped collectively. Men who had lived their entire lives on the frontier, who had seen gunfights and Indian raids and every manner of violence, stared in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Deflecting bullets with a hammer belonged in dime novels, not reality. But there stood Iron Ezra Thornfield, the hammer still raised, his pale blue eyes fixed on Dalton's terrified face. The sheriff's hands trembled as he tried to cock his revolver for a second shot, but his nerve was broken. The legendary blacksmith he had heard about in whispered stories was real, standing in front of him, and nothing in Dalton's experience had prepared him for this moment. The forge yard had filled with townspeople despite the danger. They formed a loose circle around the building, effectively trapping Dalton and his remaining men inside a ring of witnesses. Some held weapons. Others just watched with the fascination of people seeing history unfold. They had lived under Dalton's thumb for years, and now they watched their oppressor face something beyond his ability to intimidate or corrupt. 6 men down, Ezra said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. His pale eyes cataloged the remaining threats with professional detachment. Sheriff Dalton, still armed but clearly rattled. 2 deputies outside, both looking for escape routes that no longer existed. The tactical assessment was automatic, a skill burned into him by years of staying alive, when staying alive required killing other men faster than they could kill him. Sarah McKenna moved among the wounded deputies with quiet efficiency, checking injuries and offering water from her canteen. Her movements were gentle but sure, showing the mercy that separated civilization from savagery. None of the fallen men were permanently damaged, their injuries painful but not crippling. It was a demonstration of skill more frightening than simple brutality. Dalton backed toward the forge's rear wall, his gun wavering between targets he knew he could not hit. The mathematical certainty of his situation was becoming clear. He was trapped in a building with a man who had just deflected a bullet with a hammer, surrounded by a town that had found its courage, facing odds that no amount of bluster could overcome. Outside, Pete Garrison's voice carried across the yard with the authority of a man who had earned his opinions through blood and sacrifice. Iron Ezra Thornfield never killed a man who didn't earn it, he called out. Every Confederate officer who fell to that hammer was a slaver and a traitor. Every Union soldier who fought beside him came home because of what he did. The crowd murmured agreement, their fear transforming into something harder and more determined. They had lived with Dalton's corruption, his protection rackets, his casual cruelty toward women and the elderly. They had endured because they thought they had no choice. But standing before them was proof that some men chose to fight rather than endure, and that choice could make all the difference. Ezra stepped forward, his hammer loose in his grip, but ready. The movement was unhurried but implacable, like the advance of winter or the rising of the tide. Dalton raised his gun with desperate haste, but his hands shook too badly for accurate aim. "Last chance, Sheriff," Ezra said quietly. "Walk away now, and you live to see tomorrow." Desperation makes men dangerous in ways that courage never could. Sheriff Dalton's eyes darted around the forge like a trapped animal seeking any escape from the inevitable. His gun hand trembled, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the autumn chill, and his breath came in short, panicked gasps. When a cornered predator realizes it cannot win through strength, it turns to the tactics of cowards. His arm shot out with surprising speed, wrapping around Sarah McKenna's throat as she knelt beside one of the wounded deputies. The movement was so sudden that even Ezra's legendary reflexes could not prevent it. Sarah gasped as Dalton's thick forearm pressed against her windpipe, her green eyes wide with shock and fear. "Back off, Thornfield." The sheriff's voice cracked with hysteria as he pressed the Colt's barrel against Sarah's temple. His hand shook so badly that the metal clicked against her skull with each tremor. "I'll kill her, I swear I will. You back off right now, or the widow dies." The forge fell silent except for the whisper of cooling metal and Sarah's labored breathing. The crowd outside pressed closer, their anger transforming into helpless fury at seeing an innocent woman used as a shield. Old Pete Garrison raised his Navy Colt, but the angle was impossible. Any shot that missed Dalton would strike Sarah. Ezra stopped his advance, but something in his pale blue eyes shifted like winter ice beginning its deadly crack. His voice, when it came, carried the flat certainty of a man who had calculated all possibilities and found only one acceptable outcome. "You just made your last mistake." The words hit Dalton like physical blows. In those 5 syllables lay 40 years of accumulated violence, the compressed fury of a man who had spent decades trying to atone for what he was, only to have that peace shattered by cruelty that demanded justice. "I mean it, old man." Dalton's voice rose to nearly a scream. "One more step, and I paint the wall with her brains." Sarah's eyes found Ezra's across the smoky interior of the forge. Her face was pale but determined, and in her gaze he saw the same courage that had carried frontier women through Indian raids and harsh winters, and the daily brutality of carving civilization from wilderness. She was afraid, but she was not broken. "You won't shoot her, Sheriff." Ezra's hammer hung loose in his grip, but his stance remained balanced, ready. His voice carried the certainty of a man reading established fact from a book. "You're not a killer by choice. You're a bully who hides behind a badge. Killers don't shake like leaves in a windstorm." Dalton's gun hand trembled more violently, the barrel wavering against Sarah's temple. His face had gone gray with terror and rage, the features of a man watching his world collapse around him. "Watch me, you bastard. Just watch me." But Ezra was already moving, not toward Dalton, but to his left, forcing the sheriff to pivot to keep him in sight. The movement was deliberate, calculated, each step part of a larger strategy that existed in the blacksmith's mind like a blueprint for disaster. The forge's layout became Ezra's ally once again. By moving toward the bellows, he forced Dalton to turn his back toward the open doorway where the crowd had gathered. The sheriff was now trapped between the furnace and the wall, his escape routes limited to the narrow space Ezra allowed him. "You think you're so smart, Thornfield." Dalton's voice broke with barely contained hysteria. "You don't know what you're dealing with. This whole territory belongs to Judge Morrison and his syndicate. Kill me, and 50 men will ride into this town and burn it to the ground." The revelation hung in the smoky air like the confession it was. Dalton's corruption was not isolated but part of a larger network that stretched across the frontier, feeding on the vulnerability of settlements too small to defend themselves. It was information that changed nothing about the immediate situation, but explained the scope of the evil that had taken root in places where the law was whatever the strongest man said it was. "Maybe so, Sheriff." Ezra continued his careful movement, each step placing him at a better angle for what he knew must come. "But you won't live to see it." The hammer in his hand moved slightly, not threatening, but adjusting, finding the precise grip that would deliver maximum force with surgical accuracy. 40 years of working metal had taught him exactly how much pressure was needed to shape iron, and men, he had learned long ago, were considerably softer than iron. Dalton saw death approaching with the inexorable certainty of sunrise. His gun hand stabilized as desperation overcame tremor, the barrel pressing harder against Sarah's temple. Her breathing had become shallow, rapid, but she kept her eyes fixed on Ezra's face with trust that was both humbling and terrifying. "I'll do it, Thornfield. God help me. I'll kill her before I let you take me." Ezra's response was to take another step, this one bringing him within striking distance despite the hostage between them. His pale eyes had gone flat and cold as tombstone marble, and when he spoke, his voice carried the whisper of winter wind through cemetery grass. "No, Sheriff. You won't." What happened next occurred in the space between heartbeats, a demonstration of skill that belonged in legend rather than reality. Ezra's hammer came up in an arc that seemed impossibly controlled, the heavy head passing within inches of Sarah's face before striking Dalton's wrist with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The sound of breaking bone was audible throughout the forge. Dalton's scream echoed off stone walls as his gun hand was crushed, the Colt spinning away to clatter harmlessly against the far wall. Sarah stumbled forward, gasping, as the sheriff's ruined arm fell limp at his side. But Ezra was not finished. The hammer's return stroke caught Dalton across the shoulder, driving him to his knees with devastating force. The sheriff's collarbone snapped with the sound of dry kindling, and his left arm joined his right in useless agony. "Please," Dalton gasped, tears streaming down his face as shock and pain overwhelmed his nervous system. "Please, I surrender. I give up." The crowd outside the forge had pressed close enough to see everything. They watched as Iron Ezra Thornfield stood over the broken sheriff, hammer raised for a killing blow that would end 40 years of trying to forget what he had once been. The weapon trembled in his grip, not from age or weakness, but from the internal war between justice and mercy that defined the difference between a soldier and a murderer. Dalton looked up through pain-clouded eyes at the man who held his life in scarred hands. The legendary blacksmith's face was a mask of controlled fury, but behind the pale blue eyes lay something deeper than anger. It was the exhaustion of a man who had killed too many times, who had spent decades trying to build enough good to balance the scales of his violent past. 23 Confederate officers, Ezra said quietly, his voice carrying to every person in the forge yard. Each one begged at the end. Each one promised information, money, anything to live another day. The hammer remained poised, its weight familiar in hands that had wielded it in service of a cause greater than personal vengeance. But this was different. This was not war where enemies wore uniforms and served a flag that represented an ideology he could hate. This was just a broken man whose crimes, however heinous, did not require death to balance the scales of justice. But killing you won't bring back the people you've hurt, Sheriff. It won't undo the corruption or heal the fear you've spread through this town. Sarah found her voice, though it came out hoarse from Dalton's chokehold. "He's finished, Mr. Thornfield. Look at him. He'll never threaten anyone again." She was right. Dalton knelt in the forge's earthen floor, both arms hanging useless at his sides, his face gray with shock and agony. Whatever authority he had once wielded was as broken as his bones. The man who had terrorized Copper Creek with his size and brutality was reduced to a whimpering invalid who would require help to feed himself for months to come. Ezra lowered the hammer, the decision made with the finality of a judge's gavel. The weapon that had ended so many lives returned to its place as a tool rather than an instrument of death. The crowd outside released a collective breath, understanding that they had witnessed something beyond simple violence. They had seen mercy triumph over vengeance, civilization conquer savagery. "You'll live, Sheriff, but not here." Ezra's voice carried the authority of absolute command. "You'll be loaded on the next stage out of town. If you ever set foot in this territory again, if I hear of you wearing a badge anywhere in the West, I'll hunt you down and finish what I started today." Dalton nodded through his tears, the movement barely perceptible but unmistakably submission. Whatever network of corruption he had served, whatever promises of protection he had received, meant nothing in the face of broken bones and shattered authority. He was finished as a lawman, as a threat, as anything more than a cautionary tale. The forge began to empty as townspeople came forward to help carry away the wounded. Sarah moved among them with quiet efficiency, her natural compassion overcoming the trauma of her near-death experience. Old Pete Garrison approached Ezra with the reverent respect of one soldier acknowledging another. "That took more courage than killing him would have," Pete said quietly. "It's harder to let a man live when he doesn't deserve mercy." Ezra set his hammer on the anvil where it belonged, his hands steady once more despite the violence they had just delivered. "Maybe that's why it matters, Pete. Maybe the hardest choices are the ones that define what kind of men we really are." Outside, Copper Creek was already beginning the slow process of healing. Dalton's remaining deputies had fled when their leader fell, taking with them the corruption that had poisoned the town for too long. The circle of witnesses who had watched justice unfold would carry the story throughout the territory, and with it the knowledge that some things were still worth fighting for. The forge fell quiet except for the whisper of cooling coals and the soft sound of Sarah's voice comforting the wounded. Ezra stood alone beside his anvil, surrounded by the tools of his chosen trade, no longer the legend of Iron Ezra Thornfield, but simply an old blacksmith who had remembered, for one terrible afternoon, what he had once been. 3 weeks after Sheriff Dalton's broken body was loaded onto the eastbound stage, Copper Creek began to breathe again. The transformation was subtle at first, visible only in small details that spoke to those who knew how to read the signs of a community healing from long trauma. Children played in the streets without glancing nervously over their shoulders. Women walked to market without the hurried pace of people expecting trouble. Men conducted business without the wary alertness of prey animals sensing predators. The new sheriff arrived on a Tuesday morning, a lean man named Thomas Brady whose credentials had been personally vouched for by the territorial governor. Brady wore his badge like a responsibility rather than a license, and his first official act was to visit Ezra's forge to pay his respects to the man whose actions had made honest law enforcement possible again. "Mr. Thornfield," Brady said, removing his hat as he entered the smithy, "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did, and to give you my word that Copper Creek will have real law from now on." Ezra looked up from the horseshoe he was shaping, his pale blue eyes assessing the new lawman with the automatic precision of long experience. The young sheriff passed whatever test those eyes administered, because Ezra nodded once and returned to his work. "Law's only as good as the man wearing the badge, Sheriff Brady. See that you remember that when the job gets difficult." The forge had become something more than a blacksmith shop in the weeks following Dalton's defeat. It had transformed into an unofficial community center where people gathered not just for metalwork, but for the sense of security that came from proximity to a man who had proven that justice could triumph over corruption. Children brought their father's broken tools and left with stories that would shape their understanding of courage for the rest of their lives. Chief among these regular visitors was Tommy McCready, a 14-year-old whose father had died in a mine collapse 2 years earlier. The boy had been drifting toward the kind of trouble that claimed fatherless children when Ezra quietly offered him an apprenticeship. Tommy's first lesson had been simple but profound. Iron could be shaped by heat and pressure, but it required patience and respect for the metal's nature. "See how the steel glows red-orange when it's ready," Ezra explained as Tommy worked the bellows. "Force it too soon, and it cracks. Wait too long, and it becomes brittle. Everything worthwhile requires the right timing." The boy nodded with the serious attention of youth learning life lessons disguised as craft instruction. His hands, already growing strong from forge work, pumped the bellows with steady rhythm. Tommy had arrived as a potential troublemaker and was transforming into something better under Ezra's patient guidance. But metalwork was only part of what Ezra taught his young apprentice. The real education came in the quiet moments between customers, when the old blacksmith shared stories that had nothing to do with iron and fire and everything to do with the choices that defined a man's character. "Violence is the last tool you should reach for, Tommy, but when you reach for it, you'd better know how to use it." Ezra's voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom as they worked together, shaping a new axe head for the lumber mill. But more important than knowing how to fight is knowing when not to. Every man you hurt in anger stays with you forever. Tommy absorbed these lessons with the intensity of a boy who had seen what happened when good men stood by while evil flourished. His father had been one of those who stayed quiet during Dalton's reign, hoping to avoid trouble by keeping his head down. Tommy was determined to be different, and Ezra was teaching him how. Sarah McKenna had become a regular presence at the forge as well, though her visits served a different purpose. She brought meals for Ezra and Tommy, claiming the old blacksmith looked too thin and the boy was growing too fast to survive on bachelor cooking. But those who watched carefully saw how her visits coincided with the forge's busiest times, when the most people were present to benefit from her quiet acts of community healing. "You're spoiling us, Mrs. McKenna," Ezra said as she unpacked a basket containing fresh bread, beef stew, and apple preserves that filled the forge with the scent of home and contentment. A man could get used to such kindness. Sarah's smile carried the warmth of a woman who had found purpose in caring for others. "Kindness shared is kindness multiplied, Mr. Thornfield. Thomas taught me that before he passed." The mention of her late husband was natural now, no longer a source of pain that closed conversations, but a reference that honored memory while embracing the present. Sarah had found her way through grief to something stronger, and her friendship with Ezra was built on the shared understanding of people who had loved and lost, but refused to let loss define them. Their relationship remained carefully respectful, built on mutual admiration rather than romantic attachment. Both carried too much history to approach new connections lightly, but they had found in each other the rare gift of companionship without complication. Sarah helped organize community gatherings at the forge, and Ezra ensured her farm equipment stayed in perfect repair. It was friendship in its purest form, uncomplicated by expectations or demands. The forge itself had expanded beyond its original function. What had once been simply a place to shoe horses and mend tools had become the unofficial heart of Copper Creek's social life. Men gathered around the anvil to discuss crops and weather and politics. Women brought their children to see honest work being done with skill and pride. Even the circuit preacher made the forge a regular stop, understanding that some congregations gathered around anvils rather than altars. On quiet evenings when the day's work was finished and Tommy had gone home to his mother, Ezra would sit alone with his memories and the weight of choices that stretched back for decades. The war seemed both impossibly distant and eternally present, a ghost that haunted the edges of his consciousness no matter how many years passed. He remembered Antietam with crystalline clarity, the morning when Colonel Marcus Sheffield had ridden into Union lines under a flag of truce. Sheffield had been one of the Confederate officers who believed slavery was ordained by God, and that the South's defeat would mean the end of civilized society. He had also been the architect of the massacre at Honey Springs, where wounded Union soldiers had been executed rather than treated as prisoners of war. When Sheffield's diplomatic mission failed, and he prepared to return to Confederate lines, Ezra had followed. Not under orders, not as part of any official military action, but as a man who had seen too many good soldiers die because evil men were allowed to continue their work unchallenged. The confrontation had taken place in a moonlit clearing where Sheffield stopped to water his horse. The Confederate colonel had been surprised but not particularly alarmed to see a Union blacksmith emerging from the trees. His mistake was assuming that a man who worked metal for a living could not be dangerous in combat. Ezra's war hammer, forged in his own fires and balanced to his exact specifications, had ended Sheffield's life with surgical precision. No torture, no prolonged suffering, just the quick, clean death that soldiers understood. It had been justice of a sort, but justice that required a man to become something darker than he wanted to be. 22 more Confederate officers had followed Sheffield into whatever awaited beyond the veil. Each death had been justified by military necessity. Each killing had prevented further atrocities, but the accumulated weight of taking lives had changed Ezra in ways that peace could never entirely heal. The war's end had found him standing in a field outside Richmond, holding a hammer that had become infamous among Confederate forces. Officers who might have surrendered to regular Union troops fought to the death rather than face the legendary Iron Ezra, understanding that his presence meant their crimes had been cataloged and judgment was at hand. But when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Ezra had faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could continue hunting war criminals who escaped official justice, or he could lay down his hammer and try to build something better than vengeance. The decision to walk away from killing had been the hardest choice of his life, harder even than the choice to begin killing in the first place. The forge offered him redemption through creation rather than destruction. Every horseshoe he shaped helped a farmer feed his family. Every tool he mended allowed honest work to continue. Every piece of metalwork that left his shop was an act of building rather than breaking, a small payment against the debt he owed to a world that had seen too much violence. Now, 40 years later, that debt felt closer to balance. Tommy McCready was learning not just the craft of smithing, but the principles that made craft meaningful. Sarah McKenna had found healing through service to others. Copper Creek had discovered that corruption could be defeated when good people found the courage to stand together. The forge had become a symbol of community resilience, proof that broken things could be mended and made stronger. On a crisp October evening, when the first hints of winter touched the air, Ezra made his final peace with the past. Tommy had gone home. Sarah had finished organizing supplies for the church social, and the forge stood empty except for the tools of his trade and the memories that would never entirely fade. He walked to the back wall where a special rack held the weapon that had defined his legend. Judgment hung there in solitary display, its handle worn smooth by use, its head still bearing the scars of impacts that had shaped history in ways both large and small. The hammer looked deceptively ordinary, just another tool in a blacksmith's arsenal. But Ezra knew the difference between appearance and reality. With hands that no longer shook from age, he lifted Judgment from its rack one final time. The weight was familiar, perfectly balanced for his grip, as natural in his hands as breathing. For a moment that stretched toward eternity, he felt the temptation to keep it ready, to maintain the option of becoming once more the man who had struck fear into the hearts of evil men. But the moment passed, and with it the last vestiges of Iron Ezra Thornfield. He walked to the forge where coals still glowed red in the fading light and thrust Judgment deep into the fire. The hammer's head began to glow as heat transformed it from weapon back to simple metal, erasing the accumulated history of violence through the redemptive power of flame. When the metal reached white-hot intensity, Ezra withdrew it and began the delicate process of reshaping it on his anvil. Each strike of his working hammer transformed the legendary weapon into something new and purposeful. The head became broader, designed for shaping rather than striking. The handle shortened to better suit peaceful work. By the time the metal cooled, Judgment had become just another tool in an old blacksmith's collection. The transformation complete, Ezra hung the reformed hammer on the common rack with his other tools. Tomorrow it would help him shape horseshoes and mend plowshares. It would never again be an instrument of death, but it would continue to serve the cause of building rather than breaking. Outside the forge, Copper Creek settled into the peaceful rhythms of a community at rest with itself. Children played games in streets that no longer echoed with the boots of corrupt lawmen. Women planned church socials without fear of unwanted attention from badge-wearing predators. Men discussed business ventures that could prosper in a town where honest work was protected rather than exploited. The legend of Iron Ezra Thornfield would live on in whispered stories and dime novels, growing larger with each telling until fact became myth and myth became inspiration. But the man himself had found something better than legend. He had found peace through purpose, redemption through service, and the knowledge that even the darkest past could be transformed by the patient work of building a better future. Tommy McCready would carry forward not just the skills of metalworking, but the understanding that true strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them. Sarah McKenna would continue healing her community one act of kindness at a time. Sheriff Brady would prove that law enforcement could serve justice rather than corruption. And in some distant future, when new threats arose to challenge the peace they had built, others would remember that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they found the courage to stand for what was right. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and redemption, where an aging hero chose mercy over vengeance and community over isolation, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate the triumph of courage over corruption. We bring you tales of ordinary people who become extraordinary when circumstances demand greatness. Until next time, may you find the strength to be the person your community needs, and may justice always triumph over the forces that would tear us apart.